This is part two of the video on how to identify current period. In part one, we covered the first two options, last period and last period with data. In part two, we're going to focus on system date and flag in model. So let's just dive right in. Once again, a reminder of the model we were looking at. In this model, you can see I've got dates from 2017 through 2020. However, if I were to look at the actual data itself, you'll see I only have data through December of 2019. So we've got labels into the future that we have to contend with. In your case, you might have data into the future as well. So being able to leverage system date allows you to pick the appropriate time period so that you're not dealing with the future data or the future dates. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're just going to create a new list. And when you're working with system date, it's actually easier and more efficient to just work in script mode as opposed to working through the UI. So I'm going to just switch this over to script mode and write the code by hand in here. Now, the code that you're going to write will depend on the type of model that you are building this against. If you are using a model that is built straight off of a relational source, sometimes we refer to those as live query models or direct query models, or if you're working with a pyramid in-memory database model, you're going to use a language called PQL, which is Pyramid Query Language. If you are using SQL Server Analysis Services, either tabular or multidimensional models, you will use a language called MDX. Fortunately, the syntax for both are nearly identical. The concept is the same, the functions are just slightly different, so you will have to get the syntax correct. What I'll show you here is I actually have the syntax for both PQL and MDX, so you can just pause the video and grab the syntax that you need. In this case, we're going to do this for PQL, and in the PQL syntax, we are using the string to member function, which maps from a specific attribute and then grabs the system date, which in this case is date time function, and formats it to fit the format for the attribute that I'm trying to match. So you can see this is the sales date.month attribute here, and we're trying to match this syntax. So it's 3-digit or first 3 characters of the month dash the last 2 of the year. So that's the syntax here. If I were to run this, you'll see this is returning January of 2020 as the appropriate syntax. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this. And we'll just call this current month number 3. And then if I go back over here to my report, you'll see there's current month number 3 there. So we'll deselect all the months, just select current month number 3, and we'll get our value to return. Now, as I just pointed out earlier, in the case of my data, I don't actually have any data for January of 2020. So if I include a measure here, I get this not enough information, which basically means I returned a query with no data. So one of the things that you can do is, depending on how your data is loaded, if you're doing this for current day, you would always want to go to yesterday, not today's date. And so you might need to modify your logic. There's 2 ways to do this. I could either add something to the date time to subtract a day or a month or whatever. You'll see under the date functions, there are these add options so that I can move the date time to a previous day or month or week or whatever. Or I can leverage the member functions, and in the member functions you'll see that there's something called previous member that I can leverage. I'm going to do that one just because it's a little bit simpler less typing and whatnot. But what it's going to do is my date time is returning January. I really want December. So I'm just going to say, give me the previous member. When I run this, you'll see it's actually going to return December of 2019. So just be aware that you can either do it through the member functions or through the date functions, whatever makes most sense for you. And it depends on the complexity of the logic that you need. So now if I come back over here and I rerun this, you'll see it's returning December 2019. If I then add my measure, I'm getting my data or my query to run correctly. So that's the system date. It will take the exact day. And just be aware, depending on your model type, if this is a model that gets loaded once a day, then the system date will be based on the date at the time that the model is processed. If you're running a live query model against a relational source, it would actually use today because it's live. So it's using the system date at the time that I'm running the query. But if you're using an in-memory database, it's the time based on when the model was processed. So just be aware of that. So modifying this might depend on that schedule as to what makes the most sense. But there you go with the system date. So now let's look at the other option, which is working with the model. So what I can do is I can open up a model and show you, instead of actually going into the model definition, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you in the model that I'm using, I've got this query that's building out my date table. And in that query, I've actually added two fields, one called current day, which just compares the date to the system date. So in this case, this is SQL Server. So the system date is using this getDate function. Basically, if the date matches today, I'm going to return a Y. Otherwise, I'm going to return an N for yes or no. I'm doing the same thing for the month. So if my current month is the same month as the system date, it's going to return a Y. Otherwise, it's going to return an N. So this model happens to have that built in. You'll see them right here, current day, current month. So if I look at these, you'll see the values are Y and N. So what I'm going to do just to showcase this is I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to select all of my months and run the query. And then I'm going to add my current month flag on here as well. So you can see right here, December 19, it's saying yes. I just mentioned it depends on when the data is loaded as to exactly what the flag will return, but this flag is returning a Y for December 19, so that is the current month. So to create the logic, what we're going to do is we're going to use the same process we used for the last period with data. So we will identify that we want all of the months, and then we're going to filter it using the non-empty filter. But in this case, for the non-empty filter, we're going to go and select the flag equal to Y. So only return for me the months where the current month flag is equal to Y. And when I run this, you'll see it's returning December 2019. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this, and we'll call this current month 4. And let's go back over here. And if I deselect all of this and just select current month 4 and run it, you'll see it's just returning that 1 month. Now, just FYI, once again, you're going to have the same challenge that you have with the system date in this, in that by default, if it's returning, today, and I don't have any data for today, then realize this current month 4 will come back with no data. Okay, so you do want to set up your logic in your SQL to deal with that. In SQL, the wonderful world of SQL Server, if I always want the current day to be yesterday, then I could just say -1 and it will subtract 1 day from the date. And so I could add that to both of those and it would go to the previous day to base it on. Okay, but the beauty of doing this in SQL is I can decide what my logic should be. When should that flag be a yes and when should it be a no? So just realize that there are a lot of interesting options when you do it in the model and load that into the model itself. In fact, if we were to look at all 4 of these options, my personal preference is to do it as option number 4, the flag in the model. It's going to give you the most flexibility for designing the logic to fit what you need. However, that assumes that you have the rights to modify the model. You may not have those rights, and so therefore you will want to use either 1, 2, or 3 as your options. But all 4 of these work well. They all have their specific benefits as to when you should or shouldn't do it. But hopefully these 2 videos have given you the idea of how you can set those up. And once again, the whole point of this is so that we can do time dynamic reporting. Whether it's I want to do a rolling 6 months, a rolling 5 weeks, whatever, I have to know what the current period is. And so I'm going to use this logic to do that. In all of my examples, I've used month, but just realize you can do the same thing for day, week, quarter, year, whatever. So hopefully this gives you an idea of ways that you can solve this problem. And thank you for listening.